Welcome to my best of 3 sideboard guide for Golgari Midrange. And this is a tournament winner that won first place in the standard challenge, I believe in week 5. There were 2 different versions. There was one that was running the Archfiend of the Dross. This is not that one. So just really quickly to go over the deck, we've got 3 copies of Cut Down, 4 copies of Deep Cover and Bat, 4 copies of Go for the Throat, 4 copies of Mosswood Dread Knight, 4 copies of Preacher of the Schism, 2 copies of Liliana of the Veil, 3 copies of Sentinel of the Nameless City, 3 copies of Tranquil Frillback, 1 copy of Glissa Sunslayer, 2 copies of Shieldred the Apocalypse, 1 copy of Aklazot's Deepest Betrayal, 2 copies of Gix's Command, 1 copy of Nissa Ascended Animist in the main. As far as the sideboard goes, we've got 3 copies of Duress, 1 copy of Anoint with Affliction, 2 copies of Path of Peril, 1 copy of The End, 1 copy of Long Goodbye, 2 copies of Pilfer, 2 copies of Unlicensed Hearse, 1 copy of Night Clubber, so 3 copies of Path of Peril, sorry, and then 1 copy of Nissa Ascended Animist in the sideboard as well. So I'm going to be going over tracker data from Untapped and kind of going over what are some alternatives that some Golgari mid-range decks are running, and then what kind of the matchups are, and what I think the data suggests should be brought in for each matchup. Just wanted to say really quickly before I forget, thank you to the Hired Guns for joining as a YouTube member. Really appreciate the support. There are a couple of tiers that come with a couple of benefits, so if you want to help support me in my quest here to create free content here for standard, joining as a YouTube member is the best way to support me, and I hope I can give something back. So the reason why I decided to do this in the first place was because the sideboard guides that I found online were usually behind paywalls, or I just disagreed with what the person was suggesting, which is fine. But we have data which can kind of take a less personal approach to what's working in an archetype for at least for the most amount of people. So with that, let's get started. So first up here, what I like to do is I like to take the matchups from the most common throughout the tournament scene according to MTG Goldfish. So Esper Midrange has taken back number 1. Boros Convoke took over for a little bit, but Esper Midrange is back in the number 1 spot. And we can see here that as far as the list goes that I'm looking at from the tournament winner here, we should probably bring in Nissa Ascended Animist from the sideboard. The rest of the cards are already in the main. And then the worst performing card that has data is Shieldred the Apocalypse. As far as cards that are missing options that are in other lists but not in this one specifically, we've got Bitter Triumph, Tear Asunder. And then as far as all archetypes go, this is a nice way to look for alternatives that might be in the list but have a low data for Golgari specifically, but have been doing well against Esper midrange in other archetypes. So you have to take this one with a bit of a grain of salt, but here we can see that Liliana of the Veil is good, but we already have the Liliana of the Veil in from the sideboard. And then, so my recommendation here is for Esper midrange, we bring in Nissa, and then we take out 1 Shieldred. And this would, just for future kind of like builds and alternatives that you might be looking for if you need like additional help against Esper midrange, keep Bitter Triumph and Tear Asunder in mind. Tear Asunder, just really quickly, is particularly nice because of being able to attack the enchantments of Wedding Announcement as well as Virtue of Loyalty. So Nissa Ascended Animist is just a it's also got that destroy target artifact or enchantment like Tear Asunder does. So you got to, but also it's repeatable because it just is down ticks for 1 to be able to do that. So repeatable destroy enchantment is great against the Wedding Announcement and Virtue of Loyalty, and then also just as a mid-range threat. Esper midrange, like we can give all of our creatures +1/+1 and trample, which can help push damage through. Not to mention that Nissa can pump out an obscene amount of just mid-range threats. Shieldred the Apocalypse, on the other hand, one of the things that so there's probably a card in the list that's worse than Shieldred the Apocalypse, right? But we're going off of what the data says, and the data is a little bit sparse, and Shieldred the Apocalypse is the worst performing one, at least according to the data. And it does, Shieldred the Apocalypse does punish Rafine, but Rafine is not likely to survive with our removal, and Shieldred has a big target on its back. A lot of people will be saving their go for the throats, waiting for Shieldred the Apocalypse to come down. So it's one of those that, like, it works in theory. I could see it being a good card to keep, but at the same time, Esper Midrange has a lot of removals to get rid of threats like Shieldred the Apocalypse. Next up on the list is Azorius Control. Here we can see, again, Nissa is at the top of the list. This one's going to be a bit more of a difficult matchup. Generally, the reason why we saw Golgari midrange kind of disappear for a long segment of time was because it's not particularly good against Domain, as you'll see. But it struggles a little bit against Control, as midrange kind of tends to struggle against that sort of thing, right? There's kind of a rock, paper, scissors between aggro, mid-range, and control. Sometimes control is really, is like set up to beat aggro, and there's exceptions to the rules and such, but I'm not super surprised to see Golgari mid-range struggling against control here. But anyway, Nissa is a good thing that we can bring in here. And then we have the hand hate options of Liliana the Veil, which is already included in the main. And then the 3 copies of Duress in the sideboard should be brought in. As far as the worst performing cards in the main, we can bring out the 1 copy of Aklazot's Deepest Betrayal. It does not work particularly well against control, especially because No More Lies exiles. And then we can bring out the 4 copies of Preacher of the Schism. It's another one that does better against the aggro and mid-range threats. And then as far as alternatives lists go, we do see that some lists are exploring running Mishra's Foundry. It was quite a bit more popular when we were running the Blossoming Tortoise, kind of doing the manland-centric strategy in Golgari. That one has kind of has gone away in popularity. And I do think that version is better against Azorius Control, but it's so much worse against the rest of the field that, it's just been dropped, right? Notably here, Shieldred's Edict would be a good thing to bring in from the sideboard if you did have it, because this allows you to target the Planeswalkers specifically, get rid of the win conditions of the Wandering Emperor or Jace, the Perfected Mind. And then Terra Sunder as well can, a little bit of artifact and enchantment hate, and can pop something like a Celestis, or you can pay it for 4 and remove a non-land permanent so it can hit Planeswalkers as well. As far as all archetypes are considered, there is one that pops out in the data here that I think is worth considering, and that is Long Goodbye. So I think the data suggests that we should bring in 1 copy of Nissa, 3 copies of Duress, 1 Long Goodbye, cut the 1 copy of Aklazot's, and the 4 copies of Preacher. The missing options, once again, are Foundry, Shieldred's Edict, and Terra Sunder. So Nissa, Ascended Animist, Planeswalkers get around wraths like Sunfall and Depopulate and Farewell, so generally bringing in Planeswalkers is a good strategy against Azorius Control. You will have to time it around their counterspells, but get creative and you can sneak it in there. Duress helps eliminate the board wipes like Sunfall, get their threats out of their hand, get rid of their card draw, etc. And works well with Lily in just going for their hand. And then Long Goodbye, and it might be a little bit of a surprise, but if you've been here for my other sideboard guides, you may have noticed that spot removal actually does better than anticipated again and again in the data against control. And if you think about it, it's particularly nice to snipe a Reckless Anchorage, and they can't even hold up counterspells to protect it late in the game. And then Aklazot's Deepest Betrayal is just too slow, especially with No More Lies exiling it, so we can't loop it back into being a land and then bringing it back. It does attack their hand, which would be nice if we could get it to stick. It's just really hard to get that to work. Preacher of the Schism can give some good card draw, but again, so much point removal, you'll have a hard time sticking it to the board. Next up, we have Boros Convoke at number 3, and here we can see the tech for the go wide strategy, bring in Path of Peril, right? Cheap Wrath. Also on the list, we've got Long Goodbye, so we should be bringing those in from the sideboard. And then notably, Anoint with Affliction is it's a tough matchup against Boros Convoke, but Anoint with Affliction is probably high enough. It's certainly better than Liliana the Veil and the Mosswood Dread Knights. And then last here, we've got Duress coming in at a measly 34.2%. Not particularly a good strategy to go for their hand in Boros Convoke. And then alternative strategies, we do have a couple of missing options here, notably Gix, Yawgmoth Praetor, and that's top of the list, can help us kind of get some card advantage and draw into our threats so that we can keep parity with the Knight Errant of Eos. Then we've also got Sorin the Mirthless, which some lists have been exploring bringing in Sorin the Mirthless. It's particularly nice because of the lifelink, gives you additional threats. Archfiend of the Dross can outrace the Boros Convoke deck. Boros Convoke does struggle with the 6 toughness, and so they can't remove it with like a Witchstalker's Frenzy. And so the other trophying, or the other top 3 deck that I was thinking about reviewing was running the Archfiend of the Dross, so it was naturally set up to do better against Boros Convoke. And then also Assassin's Trophy sneaks in at the bottom of the list, which is a new Golgari rare that we got from Murders at Karlov Manor. It allows you to exile something and then they replace it with a land. It doesn't really, Boros Convoke is a very fast strategy. It doesn't really, there's not a big downside to giving them a land. As far as all archetypes go, Nissa does come here onto the list, probably because of Domain. I'm not 100% certain which archetype is kind of boosting Nissa up here, but we can kind of go off of what we already saw in the... So we can go off of the data that's specifically already in there for this archetype, 40.9%, as opposed to the all archetypes. I was saying sometimes there's contradiction. I tend to believe the archetype specific data over the all archetypes. So the strategy here, I think, is to bring in the 3 copies of Path of Peril, good to wipe out their side of the board, and then bring in the 1 Long Goodbye, and bring in 1 Anoint with Affliction. So just point removal, try to slow down their game plan, bring in the Wraths. Liliana doesn't work particularly well at attacking their hands, and because of how many go wide tokens there are, the sacrifice effect is very ineffective. And then, I'm not supposed to talk about the cards. And then we should also cut 3 copies of Mosswood Dread Knight. Missing options are Gix, Yawgmoth Praetor, Sorin the Planeswalker, Dross the 6/6 flyer, and then the Golgari trophy rare. Man, my pacing's a little struggling a little bit today. I apologize. So Path of Peril is particularly nice against the Boros Convoke. Usually you see Glistening Deluge or you see Path of Peril as kind of an answer to the go wide strategies of Bant Poison and Boros Convoke, and once upon a time the Azorius Soldiers. So a well-timed Wrath is very good to devastate Boros Convoke's strategy, especially if you can get it down before they're able to convoke into the Knight Errant of Eos, because then they have to rebuild to be able to get the payoff off of Knight Errant of Eos. Spot removal like Long Goodbye does also help kind of help you remove some of the stickier threats like the Sanguine Evangelist, and especially Anoint with Affliction, because it gets rid of Sanguine Evangelist and doesn't even spawn a 1/1 bat because it exiles it. And then, as I mentioned, Liliana the Veil is not particularly great because Boros Convoke is so good at creating 1/1 tokens, and Mosswood Dread Knight is better in longer games where you can get value out of the adventure side of it, and bringing it back. Boros Convoke is just too fast for that to really be advantageous. Versus Domain, this is the real struggle and the real reason why we saw the archetype kind of disappear for a while, is that Domain is particularly problematic. So nothing in here from the sideboard or anything to really improve our match against Domain. Everything is already in the main. And then we can see that our weakest card at the bottom of the list here is Nissa Ascended Animist, and we're not really needing to push through with the Planeswalker, and it's problematic because of the Leyline Binding as well. So alternative strategies, what we notice here is a bunch of the cards from the Insidious Roots deck are sneaking into the Golgari midrange data. Usually Untapped will parse the decks out separately, but right now Insidious Roots and Golgari Midrange are sharing the same data pool. So this one shows that you've got a much better chance of beating Golgari Midrange if you're running the Insidious Roots deck. The problem is that it's not a very competitive deck against other archetypes. And then all archetypes here, we can see that Long Goodbye makes the top 8 and should at least be considered as a potential sideboard. So my solution here is to bring in the one copy of the Long Goodbye. It's not particularly good, but we're going to cut the one Nissa, and there aren't really any suggestions other than maybe run a different archetype against Domain. And that's kind of that's why, like I said, that's why it disappeared from the tournament scene for a while there, was because Golgari Midrange was struggling so much against Domain, and Domain was popular enough that it was kind of like people just gave up on the archetype. There wasn't really a solution. So Long Goodbye can hit Topiary Stomper. Not a huge woohoo, but like it's possible. And then Nissa Ascended Animist. The problem with Planeswalkers, unlike Azorius Control, which can really struggle against the Planeswalkers, Domain does not. And the reason is Leyline Binding can hit Planeswalkers. And basically, like, so for Domain, the biggest thing that Domain struggles with is a Wrath that takes care of the herd migration. So either a Sunfall or a Depopulate after you build the board. And Golgari Midrange just doesn't have that Wrath, right? So you could try bringing in something like the Deadly Cover-Up, the Black Wrath that we got in Murders at Karlov Manor or something like that. That might make this matchup better, but I mean, this is something that I'm just guessing, right? There's nothing in the data that suggests that Golgari Midrange has any answer to Domain. And we can't even really go for their hand like we can with Azorius Control. With like, if we just max the amount of Duress and Liliana is probably another way to approach it. It's still going to be an unfavorable matchup. But you're going to have a hard time keeping up with Up the Beanstalk, and then Golgari can kind of struggle with destroying Up the Beanstalk outside of Nissa and like the Terra Sunders. And yeah, so it's a very, very uphill battle. If you have an idea, like Breach the Multiverse, I know is explored, but even then, like you're trying to kind of cheese it into hitting an Attrax off the top, and yeah, it's just no good. Versus Dimir Midrange, though, this looks quite a bit better, and this is probably why we saw a little bit more of Golgari Midrange in the top 3, is because we saw a little bit more of Dimir Midrange coming into the tournament scene. And so here we can see that Nissa should probably be brought in, and Mosswood Dreadknight should probably be taken out. And then alternatively, we've got some options here. So Fairy Dream Thief is coming in from the Insidious Roots deck, and then the Virtue of Persistence is coming in as an alternative that's not in the list, that I personally know is good against Dimir Midrange for removing their threats and stabilizing against their early pressure. And then one thing to note here is that there is contradicting data, again, with the Aclazotz. So Aclazotz is at the top here. Earlier it was not. And once again, I tend to believe the archetype data before and kind of use this as a, maybe we missed something. One way we could do about it is just like not take out the Aclazotz and go like, well, maybe the card is actually good, and leave that up for interpretation, right? And so we can take the second worst card out, which is a little bit more, doesn't have contradicting data. And the second one is the Mosswood Dreadknight. And so we could bring in one Nissa, cut out one Mosswood Dreadknight, and then potentially a thought to bring in against these more aggro matchups like Mono Red and Dimir Midrange is the Virtue of Persistence. So Nissa Ascended Animist, Dimir has cheap interaction that can usually that can't usually deal with Planeswalkers. So Nissa gets around like the cut downs and the go for the throats. And the trick, though, is surviving until you can actually get this down, especially as a 7-drop, right? You often you're going to have to play this for a smaller amount just because of the tempo that Dimir is applying. And then Mosswood Dreadknight, I decided to cut it instead of the Aclazotz. Again, that this is all just kind of an exploration and a tool to try to help you better understand the archetype. If you decide to cut Aclazotz, then that's totally fine. Mosswood Dreadknight's better the longer that the game goes, and Dimir Midrange is one of the faster mid-range strategies. It's almost aggro, and so Mosswood Dreadknight does trade with Gix Yawgmoth Praetor, so I could see the logic of cutting Aclazotz over it, But if we can make it to 5, I've found Aclazotz to be a pretty useful tool, stabilizing and shutting down their flyers specifically. So if we can survive to turn 5, then Aclazotz is great. The problem is that Mosswood kind of helps us get to turn 5, right? So give or take, I think either one really works here as a small tweak to the deck. And then versus the mirror match here, nothing is popping out. We've got all of the stuff in the main. As far as the we could bring in Nissa is slightly better than one copy of Liliana of the Veil. And then alternative strategies, we see Skyfisher Spider that pops in from the Insidious Roots deck. We see Archfiend of the Dross does better in the mirror match. We see the Sheoldred's Edict. We see Tenacious Underdog, Gix Yawgmoth Praetor, the Mishra's Foundry, and Tear Asunder. So quite a few lists, quite a few options here as far as missing if we wanted to improve up against the Golgari midrange deck specifically. And so I think what that really points to is that like the Golgari midrange deck is still being optimized and there's still room for improvement. As far as all archetypes go, there's nothing that pops out. And so this one's pretty easy. We bring in Nissa, we bring out Lily, and it's a pretty good list of options that we could bring in if we kind of get rid of the Skyfish Spider, because I do think that one's coming from the Insidious Roots decks, but I'm not 100% certain. The Archfiend of the Dross, Sheoldred's Edict, Tenacious Underdog, Gix Yawgmoth Praetor, Mishra's Foundry, and Tear Asunder are all options that this list is not running that you could bring in and explore. Nissa, Golgari can struggle with Planeswalkers outside of Sheoldred's Edict, and not every list is running Sheoldred's Edict, like this one. And Nissa is a little bit more effective at closing out the mirror match than Liliana of the Veil. Since making them sack like a Mosswood Dread Knight isn't super effective, that they can just trigger their adventure and it comes back. The Golgari versus Golgari matchup can be a very grindy matchup, and so going for their hand for 3 can be a bit of a hit on tempo. It can be good. It depends on what point you're playing the Liliana of the Veil, and it's just going to be worse than the Nissa Ascended Animist for most matchups. Then we got mono red aggro, and we can see here the top of the list is the Tranquil Frillback, and it's nice to see the data kind of suggesting what we were intuitively thinking, which was that the 4 life off of Tranquil Frillback was not only good for destroying enchantments in Boros Convoke and in Esper midrange, but also good for stabilizing against the aggression of mono red aggro. We also see an additional, we see a copy of Anoint with Affliction, and this one makes sense because of being able to exile Squee so that it can't come back. We've got Long Goodbye that we should probably bring in. We know that spot removal works well against the early aggression of mono red aggro. And then we could probably cut the 4 copies of the Mosswood Dread Knight. They do kind of help block, but they do have problems as well. Again, they're better the more that you can cycle through their adventure and get more of that late game value. And then as far as alternative strategies go, we see that Archfiend of the Dross is another one that would be good. And so you can kind of see why some lists run the Archfiend of the Dross while others don't, right? The Archfiend of the Dross has a positive matchup on about 50% of the field, and then not so on the other 50% of the field. So I kind of like bringing it in as a sideboard option, just because, like, especially if you come up against mono red aggro and Boros Convoke, it's better against those aggressive strategies, and we just try to race them in the air. Another one, too, that was kind of a fun idea that's being explored is the Sharp-Eyed Rookie. So against mono red, because it's the larger sample size, you do tend to see these little one-ofs that were being explored that don't show up in other lists. And then as far as all archetypes go, we do see Pilfer. And so we could decide to bring in the 2 copies of Pilfer. We don't really have any data or archetype-specific data, but it still, in theory, works well enough. It's kind of like point removal. Honestly, I'd rather have like Tear Asunder or something specifically that is point removal. But Pilfer can get rid of problematic threats that your opponent is planning on playing later in the game. So we bring in the Anoint with Affliction, the Long Goodbye, the Pilfers, and we cut the Mosswood Dread Knights. And if you did have the Archfiend of the Dross, or maybe Rookie, this would be a good time to bring those in. Anoint with Affliction, again, I said it earlier, the point removal like Anoint and Long Goodbye really helps us survive the early pressure. And then especially with Anoint with Affliction, the Exile hits Squee so that Squee doesn't keep coming back. And then and then for Long Goodbye, their entire deck list is mana value 3 or less. Some of them are running some of them run 4 on I'm blanking on the name of it, but the 3/3 that like gives you a counter and pings them. It's been around forever. Some lists were running like a 1 of those, but like your Long Goodbye is still going to hit the majority of their deck. Pilfer can hit a problematic drop like Godric or Squee, so you can do this early. It's kind of like point removal, except for it gets the larger threats before they come down with haste. So I could see, at least in theory, that Pilfer is a decent idea. And then Mosswood Dread Knight, it may seem odd to bring out an early drop, against mono red where you need your stuff, but really what we want to be doing our early turns with is point removal against their threats. And Mosswood does not actually block particularly well, since they can make their Swift Spear and any of their they can make their Swift Spears off of the prowess into 4 toughness, which does not trade very well with our 3 power with Monstrous Rage. So generally against mono red, the Monstrous Rage makes it particularly punishing to block in the first place. So you're going to try to either disrupt them or race them. And Mosswood Dread Knight's not particularly good at either. Versus Rakdos Midrange, we can see Nissa again here at the top of the list. And versus the bottom here, we've got Sentinel of the Nameless City and 2 Go for the Throats. As far as missing options here, again, we see Insidious Roots coming in. So Rakdos Midrange does not do a whole lot of the go-wide disruption that Insidious Roots kind of preys on. So notably here, and also the fact that Rakdos Midrange doesn't really have the enchantment hate to get rid of the Insidious Roots either. So this is also why I believe Skyfisher Spider is kind of coming in with that Insidious Roots data. But if you're running the Insidious Roots deck, Rakdos is what you want to see. And then as far as all archetypes here, the End does make it into the list here, and that's good because it makes sense. And then we got the 3 copies of Duress as well. So against Rakdos Midrange, I think the strategy here is to bring in Nissa and the End and Duress, and take out the Sentinel of the Nameless City and 2 Go for the Throats. Nissa Ascended Animist. Rakdos, again, has plenty of spot removal, just like the Dimir midrange matchup. Go for the Throat, cut down, etc. But it can be weak to Planeswalkers outside of Shieldred's Edict. And the End lets us hit Trumpeting Carnosaur or Cruelty of Gix and disrupt their loop. And then Duress allows us to similarly attack their hand so that we can disrupt their Cruelty of Gix and Trumpeting Carnosaur loop. Sentinel of the Nameless City struggles against the spot removal, Go for the Throat, etc. And their strategy is slow enough that we don't need our own spot removal. They're not really, they're maybe like the Deep Cavern Bat and whatnot, but you'd rather be hitting that with a cut down than a Go for the Throat. And they're not really pressuring us until they hit into their combo. So I think we can kind of ease up on the point interaction. So my overall sideboard impression of going through this process is there are 2 sideboard options that didn't show up in the data at all. That was the Night Clubber and the Unlicensed Hearse. There's usually something in the best of 3 sideboard that isn't really shown much in the data. And Night Clubber is generally brought in to disrupt the Boros Convoke or any of the go-wide strategies where it preys on boards states that have 1 toughness. And then Unlicensed Hearse is brought in for a little bit of graveyard hate, specifically against the Landfall Reanimator deck, the Sultai Slowgurk deck that won in Chicago. So after that won first place, we saw sideboards start to include a little bit more graveyard hate. We've also seen a little, like a sprinkling of the Breach the Multiverse decks pop up here and there as well. That is nice to have the graveyard hate. So that was why the Unlicensed Hearse was there. As far as Pilfer and the End, so Pilfer showed up, but only for mono red, and the End showed up, but only for Rakdos midrange. And honestly, I think we're doing okay against Rakdos midrange in the first place, that I'm not really sure we need the 1 copy of the End there. And then Pilfer, I think we could probably improve upon it by just running spot removal instead of the hand hate. But just personal preference, I'd probably be looking into replacing them because I do like to lean on the data. As far as Nissa goes, I think that there were enough matchups that I'd be tempted to just bump it up to 2 in the main. As far as the missing options go, I think Shieldred's Edict and Terra Sunder would make interesting sideboard options, as well as Archfiend of the Dross, because there were some decks that have a hard time answering it, and you could bring it in against those matchups specifically, and then bring it out when you're not against those. I'd be tempted to do something like that. And then if we really wanted to try to have a hope against Domain, I have seen people sideboard in things like Breach the Multiverse. Again, it's pretty slim, so I don't think personally I would do it. But if you're really looking for, ways to beat Domain and improve that matchup, I do think Breach the Multiverse, at least like a 1 copy, gives you at least the Hail Mary option of being able to beat them. So, if you've made it to this point, thank you very much for listening to my best of 3 sideboard guide for Golgari Midrange. And please let me know what has been working for you and what you think. I think sideboards always make interesting discussions. And this is a weekly series, so if you'd like more content like this, remember to click like and subscribe. Thank you again to Hired Guns for joining as a YouTube member. I greatly appreciate the support. And I will be taking a break for a week or 2, but I'll be back in April to cover Outlaws at Thunder Junction and resume the weekly sideboard guides. So we've got Domain and Mono Red, I believe, and then we've got the top 8 covered. So hopefully we can get that done. If not, I'll do my best to make up for it, So good luck crushing your matches and RCQs, and I'll catch you later.